I'm Steve Long. I'm the Cary and Maguire University Professor of Ethics at Southern Methodist University. I think one really important reason for studying and teaching and even writing theology today is because theology, the science of God, the study of God, is a useless discipline. Now that might be a surprising reason for why you would study theology, so let me explain. And I can do that by a story. In my first teaching appointment at a Catholic university, I was teaching a required theology class. And like almost all first-year teachers, I had way too much work for the students to do. And I saw one student becoming visibly upset as I went through the syllabus and he realized how much work this class was going to be. And finally, in desperation, he threw up his hand and he said to me, "Dr. Long, I'm a business major. What use is this course in helping me market a taco?" And I thought that was exactly the right question. I said to him that was a very important question because the study of God, theology, is useless. And by that, I mean what St. Augustine meant by it, and that is to say, knowledge of God is an end in itself. It is not a means to something else. Most of what goes on in education today is a means to something else. We've even created this acronym, ROI, Return on Investment, that every student knows. And so we've reduced education, study, and knowledge to a means, even a form of investment. But the knowledge of God is an end in itself because God is not to be used for anything else. As Augustine put it, God is to be enjoyed, not used. Now, having said that, let me then say a second reason to study theology is precisely because God's uselessness has an important use function in the modern university. Where are we going to find people who have the ability to study, to contemplate simply for its own sake and not turn it into a means, to instrumental reason? I think both in theology and philosophy, it's imperative that we recognize that when it comes to truth, goodness, beauty, the study of God, these are things that make us human. And they're not means to achieve anything other than what is good, true, beautiful, and hopefully discover God. So if I need to give students a reason why that matters, then often those reasons become more important than the subject matter itself. And then a third reason is because I think we should be unapologetic in our scholarship as intellectuals in the life of the church and the academy today. Especially when the idea is that somehow with a populist sentiment that education does something to you which is destructive. I'm a Methodist. I'm ordained in the Methodist Church. I write as a Methodist and a Wesleyan. And one time John Wesley, who had an Oxford degree, was preaching to some coal miners, and a coal miner yelled to him, "Mr. Wesley, God don't need your education." To which he responded, "And neither does he need your ignorance, sir." And I've always found that, even though it seems a bit off-putting, I actually think it's quite true. We should be unapologetic that faith requires reason and study. Otherwise, what we get is just a version of a populist fideism, which I think is a very destructive force. So I do think that the university and the church should have a stake in studying and reading and writing theology. And as I go about speaking both in churches and in the academy, I find people are fascinated by discussing the doctrine of the Trinity, why it might matter, what it means to be the church. And too often we keep that intellectual endeavor away from them, I think for fear that somehow it will inhibit faith, or possibly they are incapable of understanding. And I don't think any of those reasons are adequate. We need to study, to read, to write theology, and to train the next generation in sacred wisdom. I like to think of myself as a generalist, and I've written on a variety of topics, and sometimes when I look at the books on my shelf that I've written, I'm a bit puzzled by it and wonder what connects all of these different conversations. Sometimes I think they're only connected in my head. But I do like being a generalist, and I think it's important. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, thought that one of the problems with modern knowledge was that it tended to be too specialized. He correlated modern philosophers to assembly line workers and was concerned that everybody would know one thing, but no one, everyone would specialize and just know one thing, but no one would know the whole, the total of what it is we're trying to produce. And the university itself, it gets its name from the Latin term universis, which means the whole. And often today, I fear in the modern university, what George Grant has called the multiversity, what we don't have a sense of the whole, that there isn't a universis. At its worst, what we have is an antagonistic, even agonistic system, where departments and colleges compete against each other for market shares. And in the midst of that, we have to ask ourselves, if we are to have a university, where lies the universis? Where lies that which holds it together and connects it? And I think this is the place for both philosophy and theology. And so my work has intentionally been generalist, in part because I'm just curious about everything. And I write one book and realize, like every book is always unfinished. You never have the final word. You're always in the midst of the conversation, and the conversation continues in ways you hadn't anticipated. So when I wrote my first book on Paul Ramsey, who himself was a thinker who incorporated philosophy, theology, biblical studies, political philosophy into his work. When I wrote that book, I realized there was so much more to do, and it branched me out into a number of other disciplines in War and Peace, theology and economics, but also theology proper. Another thing that has given rise to my disparate interests is conversations with students, and how in your teaching, all of a sudden you realize, well, here's something that's missing today. Here's what we need to discuss. And so you find yourself researching that area, writing on it, presenting it, and then realizing, oh yes, and now that I've said this, I also need to say this. So there are connections, there are threads through my disparate work, but sometimes they're difficult to find, and I don't mind that, because the last thing I want to do is to be a specialist who has spent his entire life simply on one subject when there's just so much available. I'm now the university professor of ethics at Southern Methodist University, which is a wonderful opportunity. As a university professor, I'm not in a department, which means I don't have departmental meetings, which is a real gift and grace. But it also means that I'm supposed to figure out what it means to be a university professor in the modern university, especially when it comes to ethics. And so I see this last portion of my vocation trying to discern what it means to work in the modern university, which has a connection to its religious history. It is called Southern Methodist University, and at the same time has been very hospitable to other religions, to secular persons. How do we bring all of this together into the university, into a project that everyone has a stake in, but also has a common life? I find myself returning to some of the earlier themes that I've worked on. Especially right now, I'm focusing on the question of what does it mean to love one's enemies, how that works out politically, theologically, how you can begin with something like the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' difficult teachings, and then take those teachings and speak not only to the church, but also to the wider community in the university and say, here is something that makes a life worth living. For I do think that one way we can address this question of what it means to be a university today is to remind students of the importance of this question: what does it mean to live your life well? And no matter how many bankers and lawyers and teachers and nonprofit specialists we create, if we can't address that question, what does it mean to live your life well? Then it seems to me we're missing something central in the life of the university. So this new position has given me the opportunity to ask that question in a variety of departments with all kinds of students, but mindful at the same time of the religious heritage of the university. The Theo-political Vision series was initiated by a Roman Catholic theologian, Chad Pecknold, who thought it was important that we had an ecumenical conversation between a Catholic himself, mainline Protestant myself, and an Anabaptist, Tom Heilke. And so together we fashioned a vision for what we called the Theo-political Visions based upon the work of William Cavanaugh on his theopolitical imagination. Now the term theopolitical is intentional. It is a reversal of the idea of political theology. There's just a minor difference between the two, but the theopolitical vision suggests that theology itself has a political vision, rather than beginning with the idea of the political, the nation state, and trying to figure out how it's theological. The Theo-political Vision series assumes that the church in itself is a kind of politics. But this poses a real problem because we all know that the state of the church today is not what many of us would like it to be. And not only that, but the church is deeply divided. Not only Catholics and Protestants, but Catholics against Catholics and Protestants against Protestants. So we thought it would be worthwhile to bring together Catholics, Protestants, and Anabaptists into a conversation about what is a good and true political order. Chad Pecknold then is no longer an editor of the series, so we brought in Deborah Dean Murphy, who is also Roman Catholic, so that we could continue this conversation between Catholics, Protestants, and Anabaptists. And if you read the books in the series, we've published just some wonderful books in this series. If you read them, you'll see that almost all of them deal with a theme of theopolitics, of political theology, from the perspective of either a Catholic, an Anabaptist, or a Protestant, and often in conversation with each other.